Good morning. Thank you for joining us today at the American Enterprise Institute. I think this is going to be a really interesting event, so I appreciate you all who got up to be here in person, and for those of you who are out there watching this on video. Just a quick run of show so you know what we have got going on here. We're going to have Alex Tamkin, who's with Anthropic, who has written a really interesting report known as Clio that I found fascinating and was so excited they gave us the opportunity to let him talk to you about it today here. It's about what is the derivative of it, which we're excited about, is the workforce and education elements that have come out of watching how artificial intelligence is changing the dynamic in workforce and therefore what we should be doing in the dynamics of education. Alex will be followed by Jason Owen-Smith, who's a professor at the University of Michigan in sociology, but also because of that, spends a lot of time in these two areas. So he will be doing a response. And then we're going to have a panel discussion with my colleague, Brent Orell, who's a senior fellow here who works on workforce and education, who he and I didn't used to spend this much time together. But, you know, I used to be like the tech person, and that wasn't interesting to the workforce person until now. It's very interesting. So what was great for me is I've been in tech for a long time. I'd always say when we stop talking about the thing and talk about what the thing does, and I think we're finally at that stage where what artificial intelligence is doing in our society is becoming much more exciting to some people. I know some of us still like to talk about the bits and bytes as the actual artificial intelligence itself. And to have that conversation, we have the great opportunity to have Ashley Gold, who's a reporter at Axios, who covers tech, but as I was just discussing with her these days, she gets to covering tech's a lot, and also what's going on with that in Congress and the administration. So Alex, let's get started with you.
All right, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to talking to you all today about our work on which economic tasks are performed with AI. So this is evidence for millions of cloud conversations. This is joint work with a lot of folks at Anthropic across a wide range of teams, especially my co-lead in the work, Kunal Honda. And it's part of a broader effort that's called the Anthropic Economic Index, where we're trying to basically chart out and understand how is AI going to shape work as the AI capabilities advance and as the tech continues to diffuse through society. So where we're starting from here is that AI is already starting to have an impact on the economy. We're seeing it diffuse across a wide range of different use cases in coding, but also a much wider range that we'll talk about today. And we're going to see that impact only increase over time as the technology advances, as the underlying compute infrastructure advances, and as new product surfaces are developed and the tech continues to diffuse. And so we need to basically have data to measure and predict what that impact is going to be. If you ask 10 different people their thoughts on what the impact of AI is going to be on the economy, you're going to get 10 different answers. And that's because we really just don't have that much data about how the technology is being used and its applications in society. So what prior research tells us is it tries to guess at looking at what AI seems to be capable of and looking at different skills in the workforce, what's that overlap, and trying to forecast forward what the impact is going to be. But as one of the major developers of a language model, we can actually predict and measure what that impact is going to be by actually looking at real-world usage data using privacy-preserving techniques that we've developed. And so the plan for how we're going to do this is we're going to map conversations on Claude AI, which is our consumer web and mobile app offering. And we're going to map those to conversations in the ONET database, to tasks in the ONET database, to look at what tasks people are using AI for. And then we're going to bubble that up and look at what occupations have tasks with the highest usage, and then look at further insights into how AI might impact work. So starting with the first one, we use the ONET database, which is a large database provided by the US Department of Labor, which has many different occupations and their associated tasks. So say if you're a data scientist, you make charts, you analyze data, you apply sampling techniques, and it has metadata like wage and barriers to entry. And we have this for all of the different tasks in the economy, including anesthesiologists, college history teachers, etc. And then given a conversation, we can then ask Claude, our model, what task it best corresponds to. Right? And these are 17,000 different tasks in the ONET database, and we can basically map millions of conversations across these tasks. So, for example, if you were to tell the language model, here's this data, I want you to make a nice stacked bar chart for me, and Claude says, sure, I'd be happy to, then you can actually classify, it would then classify that as, create graphs, charts, and other visualizations, which is then tagged up to the data science, the data scientist occupation. And so then we can bubble up all of those tasks into the relevant occupations, and then bubble those up into high-level occupational categories to then map out AI usage across the economy. And what we see there is that you can actually then compare the US economy to the Claude economy. You can actually compare what type of economic activity you're seeing on our AI systems with the distribution of jobs in the US economy. And what we see here is that jobs that require moving objects in the real world, right, in-person human relationships, those are big parts of the US economy, not yet big parts of the AI economy, because it's just a thing that you go to on your computer or phone at the moment. But software engineering jobs, which are only 3% of the US economy, are 40% of the cloud economy. So coders and programmers, if you know anyone in this industry, are just adopting AI at a really massive rate to use it for debugging code, creating prototypes, building computer systems. You also see that media and entertainment, writing, tasks with a lot of writing and creativity are overrepresented in the cloud economy. People are using AI to get feedback on their writing, to draft, to iterate. And we also see a huge amount of usage in the natural sciences. So people using AI for energy research, for physics, chemistry, biology, medical research. We also see really high cloud usage there. Here's another cut on this data. So it's the same data you were looking at before, the distribution over industries, but it's and high-level occupational categories. But we can show you a few example tasks and occupations within each category. So for computer and mathematical, we see computer programmers, software developers, people using AI to debug code, to program computer systems, and to design different components. We also see usage in arts and media, in tasks associated with technical writers, copywriters, editors, and we see use for writing and drafting and editing in film, in communications, in PR. And in education, we see use associated with tutors, with archivists, with instructional designers, people using it to write lesson plans, brainstorm ways to teach classes, and other sorts of design there. So that's where people are using the technology, but how deep is that use, right? If you do 20 different jobs in any given day, 20 different tasks, what fraction of those 20 are things that you can use AI for? And that's what this chart shows. It shows that over a third of occupations are seeing use in a quarter of their associated tasks, right? Now, 11% of jobs are seeing it in over half of their tasks, and 4% of jobs are seeing it in a majority, in 75% of tasks. And so this sort of says that there's a wide range of jobs in the economy see at least some usage in a good fraction of their tasks. And a very small fraction at the moment, about 4%, are seeing AI with the potential to be used across the majority of their tasks. All right, so now let's characterize this a little bit more and dive into a little bit deeper analysis. This is wage. So all of those different occupations, ONET and associated data sets in the US Department of Labor have associated wage information. So we see the US median wage at around 60,000. And then you can see that actually AI is used for tasks associated with jobs in the upper mid quartile of jobs in the economy. So certainly for computer programmers and software developers, but also a wider range of tasks in that upper mid quartile. Correspondingly, you see less in the leftmost extreme for jobs that require a lot of manual labor, in-person presence. And you also see much less work usage in AI for tasks that are associated with jobs that require that are in highly regulated industries like medical industries, high-risk industries, or industries maybe where you haven't quite seen as much AI adoption or diffusion because these industries tend to be a little bit more conservative with the deployment of technology. So we see, for example, obstetricians, anesthesiologists in the far right. This is one of my favorite slides. We see where are people using AI, but how are they using it? And we bucketed these into two general high-level categories. Augmentation, where people use AI for checking their work, for learning about new concepts and how to do their work, or for iterating on a task, going back and forth, asking for feedback, saying, can you change this, can you change that? That's what we see the most for augmentation. And we see about 30% more augmentation than we do automation. So these are tasks like you just go to the AI and say, translate this to this, edit this, write this, and not much back and forth iteration or human involvement. And that is the directive. And then feedback loop is coders who do interact with the model, but only, rather than providing direction, they only provide what error they got in the output of their code. And that's because that's something that sort of process of taking the error and putting it back into the model is starting already to be more automated through products that are coming out into the market. So there's a bunch of limitations, and we'll get into these a lot more in the panel very shortly, but I'll just preview them a little bit. One is that this is only data from one provider. We are only, we are an AI system and an AI provider, but we don't, for example, generate images or videos. And there's a wide range of other types of AI that exist and that people are using AI for. We use a model to actually classify this. It's a task that would be impossible to do for a human because each thing you have to categorize into one of 17,000 different occupational tasks. And we do validate that this works quite well, but it is something to flag. Also, we don't look at how complex the task is, right? So data scientists can do very, very simple statistical analyses that a first-year undergraduate could do, or do sort of years-long, PhD-level studies. And that's not something that we get into in this report. And we also look at ONET, which is tasks as they exist today, right? AI is going to produce new types of tasks fundamentally, and that's not something that would show up in our data. And finally, we don't know how people are integrating the products, the things that they're getting from AI, how they're integrating that into their workflows, right? So, they might get an output from AI, and then they might refine it. They might use it, integrate it with other sources, and so it might be more augmentation that's happening, or other types of collaborative workflows that we don't have visibility into. So, where do we want to go? Our data is publicly available. So many economists have already reached out and are starting to use this, and we'd love to see more usage across the industry. We're actually going to be updating the economic index continually with new research and as models continue to improve. So think about this as the first point in a larger trajectory. And we hope to see a broader movement across the field towards increased transparency. It's not something that we can do as as just one provider, as we talked about earlier, and only a full picture across the whole industry will really enable us to have the information to really chart a path forward. So thanks so much, and with that, I will pass it along.
Alex, thank you for that. It is really interesting stuff, but I'm looking forward to all of you making it shorter for everybody else to be able to read. It's lots of data in a good way. Jason, why don't you come on up?
Thanks very much for having me here. It's really exciting stuff. And what I'm going to try to do today is first respond a little bit to the paper and then position that in broader efforts to take data like these and understand how we can put them together to make them a useful resource for decision-making about AI and work at multiple levels. So the data you've just seen could really add a whole lot to efforts to inform measures and standards that could give us information that we need and don't currently have for decision-making. Right? It lets us see, potentially, the emergence of new tasks and skills, as well as what's being used with skills now. So a question for you is, what are people trying to do that doesn't match, and do any of those cluster in predictable ways? That'd be great. What kinds of prompts fail? One of the things that's a challenge is what capabilities the models have and how well they apply. It'd be really interesting to be able to validate, right? If I'm using Claude in my basement to finish my opus about Klingon opera, that's a different kind of thing than if I'm using it at work, than if I'm using it in a way my employer is mandating that I use it at work. Skill development. Do people get better? What's the internal variation? Geography. You'll see a bunch of the reasons why I'm considering these questions as I move on to the question of what we need for standards and measures that can make data like these actionable for the kinds of people who are trying to make decisions in a very uncertain and fast-moving world today. And to get at that, right, you can think about where we both started, which is this idea that AI is making huge changes in the economy, and those changes are uncertain. There's a quote from Jeff Hinton, who won the Nobel Prize for some of his AI work. And the question is, how huge are these effects? In macroeconomic terms, right, unsober predictions run from apocalypse and species extinction to utopia, but sober predictions vary by approximately 2 times the size of Germany's GDP. And when you ask why that is, there's no way to adjudicate, because the difference isn't in the models, it's in the data that feed the models. Right? What's missing to let us get to good expectations is information about precisely this kind of stuff. What skills are being affected? How many people are using it? What are the capabilities? Right? It's even more pressing, I think, is that even if we had the right macroeconomic data, the macroeconomy doesn't actually allow most of the people who need to make decisions on the ground to make those decisions. Right? Like politics, most economic decisions are local, right? So businesses, state workforce agencies, economic development groups, education and training providers, even students like my children, who right now are making decisions about what classes to take in the hopes of trying to land jobs that are going to be changing as a result of this, need to make decisions not based on broad national trends, but based on local, regional labor markets. So the question is, how do we get to data that incorporates things like the valuable stuff here about local, regional labor markets? And the answer is, we need to build a sparkly fountain, right? The data, the kinds of things you've just seen, are the beautiful, sparkly fountain. What we often forget when we think about data about AI is the underlying plumbing. The underlying plumbing, which I know, Alex, you've been building in your case, right, is driven by community standards that allow data to be interoperable and trusted and usable at multiple scales. And so the question for a data set like this is both what it can do and how it can fit into these larger efforts. Right? Which brings us to what these kinds of data need to have and to look like in order to be usable by groups like that at a regional, granular level. They need to be timely. Lovely. These data could be up to date to the moment in principle. Right? They need to be regional. They need to fit in a particular industry or region where people are searching for and understanding jobs and the changes they bring. They need to be granular, tasks, skills, jobs that are actually actionable for decision making. They need to be actionable in the sense that they are both forward-looking, is one of the things I like about these data. They get at how people are using the technology now and they can see the trends, right? But also in the sense that they're validated against things in the world, right? And they need to be trusted, which is where community standards, processes for developing the data, and for seeing them in use by decision makers and local experts becomes really essential, right? These kinds of bottom-up processes to produce trusted data run through and are driven by, in the case of the work that we're doing with AEI and with Brent and others, run through the state labor market information systems, right, and employers and universities and training providers who are defining value, making questions, building use case demonstration projects, and iterating through a process of defining standards for data integration, using them, and bringing them back through a process that improves them, so that what we see is a continuous process of use-driven development of products and standards that continue to build out the possibility for technology-aware, right, use-inspired, standard-anchored, regional, granular, actionable, and timely kinds of measures for decision making. Right? And what can be added to that by something like Clio, I think, is very much the capabilities. What happens? What changes from model to model? It's absolutely lovely stuff, right? What new things are being done? How does this shift when you go from your own personal account to an enterprise account owned by your employer? These would all be really interesting kinds of possibilities. Right? This is an example of the kind of thing that we have built thus far. So here, these are jobs and earnings measures, the first, to our knowledge, that have ever been developed, that are regional and tied directly to particular investments in technology by the National Science Foundation and other federal science agencies. Right? Here what we see are indications of exposure at the employer level, but not yet of task level susceptibility. Right? We're working now to integrate skill level susceptibility measures of similar types to what's being done here. And that's a community-driven, state-driven, and standards-aware process. The idea is that by pulling these pieces together through a community like the one you've seen and adding, whenever we can, valuable new sources of data to address these kinds of questions, we get to a useful system to allow things like state, business, and higher education partnerships to become the laboratories of, for lack of a better term, democracy. So, there's an old statement that says a plane is just a flying collection of 10,000 standards. Right? Data for decision-making about something as complex and moving as AI and work is also, if it's to be trusted and timely and actionable, a collection of many, many standards. And those standards need to emerge from use in a community. And so the challenge, I think, is to ask, what are the unique and really exciting pieces of the work that you've seen today, of which there are many, and how might they fit into an effort to build out this kind of useful, decentralized, and bottom-up data structure. We're happy to help in developing those data as part of the plumbing for this sparkly fountain. Right? Got a framework. Brent and me have been working with AEI and a bunch of other partners to continue to flesh it out. And so I'd invite you to reach out to learn more and to join with us. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jason. All right, we're going to turn it over to Ashley to moderate the next panel.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being with us today. It's good to be with you. My name is Ashley Gold. I cover tech policy for Axios. So everything from AI to competition and antitrust to privacy and everything else going on in DC these days. It's never a dull moment in these early days of the second Trump administration. But let's get into the study and what we learned. I think one thing that hasn't been addressed yet is this bigger idea of what AI can do for either job creation or job displacement. So based on the early returns of your study, any sort of high-level observations about that?
Yeah, so one thing that Clio lets us do is it lets us look at how people are using the technology and identify potential things that aren't tracked by things like ONET. So that's something that we're very, I think, excited to look into. And in fact, we're seeing, all sorts of the emergence of new jobs like prompt engineering, all sorts of tasks, jobs oriented towards teaching computers, towards teaching with computers. And so I think we're starting to see the emergence of new types of tasks there. In terms of the impact on jobs, I think one thing that we're seeing is sort of job transformation a little bit. We're seeing the ways in which people are using AI and integrating them into jobs, and how they're collaborating with AI to do that, how AI is automating certain types or parts of the work. We don't yet know, just because of the limitations of our study, what the actual impact will be on, say, labor numbers or things like that. That's just sort of not something that the study itself can address, maybe in connection with other work or longitudinally. But that's sort of an early picture of what we're seeing.
And I want to talk about these numbers that you're seeing, that 57% was used for augmentation, 43% is for automation. Is that encouraging towards folks that might have been worried about AI's role in the workforce and it eliminating jobs? Or are you seeing it as kind of neutral? Like whether it's automation or augmentation, it's helping people with their jobs?
Yeah, so I think there's two numbers here. One is the depth of usage that we're seeing. So if you do 20 tasks in your job, are you seeing AI being useful for one or two of those, or for half of those? And so mostly we see that AI is used for like a smaller number of important, but a small number of tasks in the jobs. And then in those, we're seeing it tilts towards working with the person to do them. So I think right now we're seeing things that look a little bit more like limited job transformation. But that's, of course, something that we want to track and change, right? If AI gets more general and is used for more tasks and used in a more automative capacity, that's something that we'd be able to see early signs of.
And I just want to open up to the rest of the panel that the sort of thesis of the findings of this early study, is anybody surprised by these findings? Does it go along with what you would have expected? What are your impressions?
Yeah, I think that it's consistent with what I have been thinking about in terms of impact on jobs and skills. It's more nuanced than, it's added a layer of nuance to my own thinking about this. I think what we see is, okay, this chapter of automation is in some ways going to look a lot like prior chapters of automation, but it's going to be different in some ways as well. So with automation, we've had this concept around called skill bias technical change, where it's been pretty consistent that as new technology enters the workforce, people with more education and more skills benefit. People with less education and less skills suffer. Okay, so that's still generally true, I think, with AI-based automation. I think that we'll see a lot of people who kind of move up in their current jobs. They'll be retrained away from doing the things that could be automated in their task and move more towards supervision of algorithms and outputs from AI programs. So that's consistent. But we also see at the same time that there are certain categories of workers who are going to feel to greater and lesser degrees the effects of displacement. And if you could just advance the slide thing one more, I'll talk a little bit more. Oh, thank you. Got it.
Oh, did I do it right?
So this is the data about what's happening with hiring among people who are coders, and it's not a happy time for people with coding skills right now unless they are able to move up this level of abstraction in their work into more kind of systems architecture design, putting all of the pieces together rather than just doing coding, because of course the co-pilots are able to do much of that work on their own, and they're able to do it better. And that's this is not consistent actually with what we've seen in terms of skill bias technical change, because these are highly educated people with lots of skills that are being displaced.
Right.
And so it's not going to be an even process, but I think we can see both types of change going on.
Anybody else want to weigh in? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd add two things. One, to reiterate and expand a little bit on both of what you said. I think it fundamentally changes the way we have to think about jobs and technological change to really take seriously the task or the skill as the unit that's being changed, and to say there are some jobs where maybe a small number of tasks, and the question is, how do they fit into the larger constellation of the work of the job? What's the genome, if you will, of a given job, and what happens when one part of it is affected, right? If you replace the medical note-taking capacity of a surgeon with AI, that improves the efficiency of their work in other areas. If you replace the exact same work for a medical transcriptionist, right, you have a different set of implications. The other thing to say that I think is really important is we should be careful not to mistake the economy of people who are using AI for the economy of jobs that is affected by AI. There are two ways that happens. One, it's not necessarily immediately the case that a set of people using Claude for coding, I myself make use of Claude pretty extensively for coding, but am not a software developer. Right? And so that's where the validation comes in, which is part of the how do we integrate this? Right? More importantly, right, AI is a thing that has to be built. Right? It itself is a product. And so if you look at the building of data centers around the country, right, we have a shortage of electricians. We have a shortage of HVAC technicians. These are people whose jobs are being affected positively by an explosion of AI, even though they may not be using AI at all in their jobs, right? And being able to capture and measure that is going to be an essential part of really understanding training and education needs, implications for the economy, et cetera, et cetera. So really important to think broadly about these these implications.
So actually, this isn't specifically to AI, but a little previous to that is artificial AR and VR. So the ability to look at something and not necessarily have to put the goggles on your face, But there was a gentleman I talked to in Wisconsin a couple years ago that was using the ability to use an immediate visual off his phone for his newer tech people in HVAC. So you could send somebody who was maybe 20, 21, 22 to the top of a building, and they might encounter a legacy piece of equipment that's older than them, and they're not quite sure what to do about that. So the ability to like feed more information into the machine and say, hey, I've got this information on the truck, you can still do this, watch a quick video, is something that, you know, we actually saw on the lower rungs they were starting to develop. And so artificial intelligence is just integrating more of that efficiency cycle into a lot of people's jobs. And I think part of the interest in this too is for people that were the first movers in this who were realizing it was really good, it was trying to explain to most likely your boss that you weren't cheating. This wasn't cheating the system. This was being smarter and using the most positive elements of like information forward technology. And now that they're realizing that the other people are doing it too, you're having a better adoption rate, which I think is positive for all of us.
When the explosion of generative AI happened about 2 years ago, there seemed to be a lot of warnings attached to using Claude, using ChatGPT. Go ahead, use it, see if it helps with your work, but double check, triple check, quadruple check, like it could be wrong. It's often wrong. How far have we moved from that general assumption that what the AI spits out to you can be wrong and you need to be extremely careful about double checking before you publish or use it in some other way? Does it feel like we've moved away from, you know, issuing such strong warnings about that, or no?
I was gonna say, I think it's good information, full stop.
Okay.
So, you know, if you should always double check your work. Even if somebody else does your first round of work, we're lucky here at AEI, we have research assistants that do a great job, but I always kind of like to just validate. So that's just a word to the wise. Now we have a lot more information flow coming, you know, in the direction that we should be checking.
I mean, I think the industry folks are probably best positioned to offer some sort of numerical value around accuracy.
Right.
But I would say in the last 2 years, I mean, over the last 2 years, there's been a significant reduction in hallucination that I've noticed in my own use of the technology. At the beginning, I was like, I'd have to, you know, that's not right. Go fix that, and then it would come back. Oh, sorry, you know, here's the right answer. And so but I have to do that a lot less now. So I don't know what you know, from a technical standpoint, what you think about whether we're getting better.
Absolutely, yeah. You look at the numbers and the accuracy across, you know, even book length inputs is just getting really, really high. So I think that's part of it. There's been a lot of technical improvements that have led the models to become much more reliable and pull out and synthesize information from a wider range of sources. But I also think it's media literacy is a thing too, right? When Wikipedia, you know, first came out, when a lot of people started browsing the web, they didn't know, you know, like what are the signs of a reputable, you know, reputable piece of information.
People still don't.
Yeah, but as people use the technology more, they get better and better, I think, able to tell. And of course, yeah, like even when you're working with people, you check your sources, you double check, trust but verify, and I think that's sort of how people are learning to use the technology too. Is it's a bit of both sides, the tech, but also the social side.
One of the things that I really love about the paper is a figure you didn't show that compares Claude Opus to Claude Sonnet, right? And one of the things that's a challenge for some of the kinds of data that people are putting together is actually capturing the improvements in capabilities, not against the kinds of technical benchmarks that are reported in, say, like the Hugging Face leaderboard, but against the way that people actually use the technology. And so being able to think through how might you quantify, you know, how many feedback loops does it take to get that a code query of particular complexity done against different models might be a really interesting way to add to these kinds of questions. I think the other thing I'd say is that this is a really fascinating technology for someone like me who studies technology at work, because many of its capabilities weren't designed into it. Right? There's a Harvard group that calls it the jagged frontier. Right? There's some things, turns out these models are remarkably good at that we might not have expected them to be. And there's some things like math early on that we might have expected them to be good at that they really weren't. And this is a way to see potentially some of the things that people want them to do that they can or can't, and to see, are they evolving in the directions?
I think that's really an interesting point, that this technology is actually, we're all engaged in its development, right? We're all, the people who use it, we are all participants in improving it, because our queries are the things that drive those improvements over time. And that's a very unusual thing when it comes to technological change. I mean, technology is typically handed to us.
Right.
Here it is, it's done, use it, right? In this case, it's like, it kind of works. Let's see, let's get into it and see how we, is it really working, or how could it work better? And we're all it's a participatory technological revolution that's going on.
And in the past 2 years, have you observed people sort of getting more confident in wanting to use AI at work, and also assessing how they feel about privacy and whether what they're putting in is being used for good purposes, or whether they're anonymized enough? There was a lot of fear-mongering at the beginning of this about your personal privacy and whether it would actually be useful for work. So how have you observed attitudes on just uptake and giving it a try, and also privacy? We could start with you.
Yeah, I think that was a big focus of our work and in building Clio is there a way that you can get access to this bottom-up sort of source of what are people using the technology for, even though we're not anticipating it, and still do that in a way that, for us, very strong privacy safeguards is really important. And so we have a lot of technical details in the paper for how we do that. And even for the use of the product, we sort of have very, I think, unusually strong commitments there too. But I think in general, people are, like any technology, getting more comfortable with it, understanding where they want to use it for, how they want to use it. People, blur the lines sometimes between the very, we're talking about work. People use it for all sorts of work topics, but they also use it for discussions about work, how to approach difficult conversations, work-related topics in their personal lives, and then sort of very personal things. And I think you've sort of seen, a broadening of the imagination of what AI can be used for. I think that's something that's been really clear. We saw, for example, people using, one of the topics, the high-level topics that popped up was people using AI to help interpret their dreams, right? And then I was telling this to a friend, and he said, wait, I use Claude to interpret my dreams, I was just doing that last night, So that's been something that just has come up again and again, things that we wouldn't have expected.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Does anybody else want to weigh in there?
Well, I'm actually going to ask Alex to expand on that, because one of the first things that you all brought to me was just the whole idea of the disaggregated, the one-offs, right? Maybe there's enough dream sequencing that it might pop on the screen, but like I've got a 13-year-old niece coming to town. I'm putting together a schedule for her, blah blah blah. To me that might feel very personal. To the machine, it's just like rando over here doing strange thing. Like delete that. So when you showed me that the data points on that, I was doing it anyway, but it gave me more comfort to be able to put information into the topics that I wasn't fearful so much that this was going to come out the other end. And what we're so triggered by is our use of social media, which I love, but then it's going to say, make sure you hit the Jefferson Monument along the way, But you guys have done extensive work on that.
Yeah, no, I think we've really engaged a lot with also privacy experts before we put out the work. I'm really quite excited about it, because I think that the sort of, from a technical perspective, there's been a lot of limitations in what privacy-preserving approaches can do, especially in this bottom-up way. And we've actually seen folks from other fields be like, oh, we'd love to use this for this purpose, and all sorts of ways in which I wouldn't have thought of using a tool like Clio. So that's been exciting.
Mm-hmm. And moving gears a little bit, you said very high salary jobs not using it as much, very low salary jobs not using it as much. You used obstetrician as one example. So What other quite high salary jobs were you seeing as not using it at all? Is it mostly physicians? What are some other examples?
Yeah, I think we mostly saw medical use cases are sort of in that upper area. That's in part because a lot of it is very private information that you might not want to upload into the model. A lot of it is more high risk, but also there's a lot of things where you can use it, but it's just not, the technology diffuses more slowly, right? Coders are always faster to pick things up than, especially new technologies, than other parts of the,
Yeah, I mean, we
economy.
have doctors that don't even use electronic health records yet, so that could be part of it. But is the ultimate goal a world where physicians are using AI successfully, or are there some industries, some jobs where they're just not ever going to use it and that's fine because it's not for every job?
You've tapped into what I call the infinity loop in my head, talking to these guys, where they talk about the importance of getting the right indicators on workforce so we can adjust, and part of that goes, especially to Jason's world of then how are we doing the educational curriculum to make sure that we're educating students for the right jobs coming out of it. So if we get this right, we want these indicators to make sure that then we can make the correction so we're doing the education that we need in that space. Right now, I don't think we're doing a very good job, and I did think we're kind of muddling through it. The idea on the medical is very interesting because there's so much potential on medical breakthroughs. And then the next question I have in my head is, are we going to be able to convince doctors, who tend to have, a lot of them, a very strong ego, that they need to go back and re-educate and re-skill in their space? Because, I used to want the most senior doctor because they had the most, capability, or I've seen the most cases if you're going into like surgery. Now I'm rethinking that to I want the person who's most recently been out of medical school that's looking at the most recent tools.
Right.
So I think that's an adjustment that we're gonna have to make.
Yeah, I think the medical sector is a very interesting one, because obviously there are pieces of it that are highly susceptible to or exposed to automation, and should be. Medical records management, we shouldn't be employing so many people to code claims. On top of that, some of these sectors, like medicine and healthcare, have some of the lowest rates of productivity increase. And so we desperately need to improve productivity in the medical sector. There have been a couple studies looking at kind of physician attitudes toward AI, and they are remarkably durable. Physicians don't like using it for diagnostics. They prefer to do their own diagnostics. Now, that could be a liability issue. If I make a mistake, it better be my mistake, and rather than having to explain what the algorithm did. But it's interesting because the diagnostics actually improve with use of AI. And even that kind of evidence doesn't seem to be sufficient to sort of persuade physicians that they ought to be using the technology. So I think it's a bunch of different things. And I wanted to ask you relative to this, it's like, why wouldn't we be seeing, say, corporate leadership, very highly paid experts that are running companies, really using AI on strategy questions? Because that's one of the things that it's quite good at, is analyzing lots of data and coming back with the thing that you missed, in our own individual analysis. These systems can just manage a lot more data and pick out a lot of patterns. I mean, is that a thing? And is it like generational? I mean, is it that that people who are my age and older don't really want the cognitive burden of learning how to use it?
It's actually really interesting because when we were doing an early version of the work, and I don't remember where this popped up in the final version, but CEOs actually was, not at the very top, but was sort of a high sort of occupation that popped out because people are actually using it for high-level strategic questions. I'm not sure whether these are tasks associated with CEOs, right? We don't know whether everyone who is asking large strategic questions is a CEO, but we do see that. We see people putting in large numbers of documents and saying, help me identify common themes or rank various options, the pros and cons. I don't know what fraction, but
Maybe they're
definitely
not using
potential is
Claude,
there.
maybe they're using something else.
Maybe, who knows?
I mean, but this speaks to these really interesting questions that also go to what needs to be wrapped around data like these to get to answers. So there's the question, because queries are aligned with tasks associated with, obstetricians at a lower rate, does that mean obstetricians are using AI at a lower rate? A validation question. But there's also the interesting set of questions as to why might obstetricians or other physicians be more resistant or harder to have uptake, which is about as much licensure and regulation and medical malpractice law and a whole range of institutional areas. There's also some interesting research that suggests that, at least in the field studies that have been done, the biggest benefit of AI is actually for the people in a profession who are newer and lower skilled, right? You don't get as much of a marginal benefit if you're at the top. So if you're somebody who's good enough at doing strategic thinking to be the CEO of a major company, right, Claude may not help you as much as if you're a new middle manager trying to figure out how to do it. And so it may close the gap and limit the barriers to entry more than it raises the top. And so part of what we need to try to figure out, and I think one of the challenges for the shift from individuals using the tool at work to big companies implementing the tool at enterprise scale, is understanding the full range of complementary skills, regulatory, technological, HR, that have to wrap around such an implementation to make it workable for a firm. Right? Those things let us get to the kinds of questions you're asking in really interesting ways, but they require a lot of steps to take the very cool things that are in these data.
It's many steps from people just sort of experimenting, seeing how they can use it at work, and really not having any set of rules against how they are experimenting and using it at work. At my workplace, we have a enterprise subscription to one of your rivals, I'm sorry. And we're just told to sort of experiment with it all the time, see how it can help you with story ideas and questions to ask people. But we're never going to use it to write an article, but we're encouraged to use it to make other tasks we have to do more efficient and think of ideas. But it very much feels like we're in the experimentation, see how it works for you phase. There's no mandate to use it. It's not required. So how far do you think we are from that sort of world you described, where it's incorporated into companies at sort of this top-down level where it's prescribed to be used for different tasks depending on what you're doing, and it's very much part of the workflow and not just sort of additive?
I don't think it's prescriptive as much as it's it's an additive, and I think part of what you're getting back is that regulatory environment. So there's certain things that are very regulated, and one of them is the legal. Well, the legal profession is an interesting challenge and opportunity because they're often creating the regulations, but they have created for those who are willing to kind of dip their toe in the spaces what they call data cards, which help them guide what would normally be in a regulated environment, what's in and out of scope. So what you can and cannot be using this for, which is a lot of what I think people are looking for, are those guide rails. Like, can I use it for this? Is it okay to do it for that? In the space where you're looking for pattern recognition, and a lot of times when you're looking at legal documents, you're just looking for a particular word or an anomaly. It's very efficient in that. Now, there's other times where you're looking for a level of articulation that you do need the art and craft of writing, which it will get better at during the time, but you want to make sure that's the check your work position on that. But I think we're seeing It's a if you see some of your counterparts doing it, it also challenges people to think, well, what are they doing that I need to be thinking about, which ultimately is thinking about the prompts and how are you using the information there. But the regulatory guidance is definitely important.
So that this, from a workforce development standpoint, really brings up an important consideration, right? I talked earlier about skills bias technical change, right? I'm convinced that one of the ways that we need to modify our thinking about that is that it's really one skill that's going to bias, and that's adaptation, the ability to adapt to new technology. That's what's going to separate out, I think, in part, the people who move up the level of abstraction in their work to monitoring AI rather than doing the data entry. That's what's going to separate out, like, who are the people? The people who still retain a sense of agency in working with the AI rather than looking at it as some sort of, I heard it expressed recently, you shouldn't think of it as a tool, you should think of it as a partner in your work. And people who can conceptualize their relationship with the technology as something that they're partnering with to do more or to do better or to adapt to change, I think are going to be the ones who really thrive in this churning environment that we're in terms of the way that AI is affecting skills and jobs.
Yeah, I'd also say another challenge is the degree to which the technology is advancing very quickly and rapidly, right? So 2 years ago, the context window, the amount of information you could put in was, a few paragraphs or pages, right? Now it's books, 3 years ago, I wrote most of my code by hand. The next year, I was tab completing a large fraction of it. The next year after that, I was selecting, bits and saying, replace it with this. And now there's coding, agentic coding products like Claude Code, which we released recently, where you just talk to it in the terminal and say, oh, make these changes, and it edits 50 files, And that's going to happen. It's happening in coding, but it's going to happen across all of the other sorts of areas of work. And new interfaces, even if the model stayed the same, we'd be developing new product interfaces for them that would totally transform the ways in which we use them. And so I think that is also one reason why it's hard to standardize.
And since we're in Washington, we can at least talk a little bit about policy. Are we at all in a place yet where state and federal lawmakers are well positioned to pass policy about AI in the workforce? Is it way too early? And have you seen any good examples of policy around the country that you'd highlight?
So I would say, as with most things related to AI, I think it's, and policy and regulatory questions, it's like, everybody take a breath. We don't know enough yet about what kinds of policy we're actually going to need. In the case of workforce, how are we going to cope with what the impact on skills and learning and jobs? And it's like, well, first of all, we don't really know yet. So it certainly doesn't make sense to try to restrict the use of AI in order to protect jobs. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But to the extent that we're thinking about policies that can help people with the reskilling demand that they're facing, that's very much worth thinking about. And I don't think has been engaged at the level that it ought to be. Not because we want to immediately implement anything. Like with these coders, the theory here is that these people are going to sort their own lives out. They're going to figure out what to do next. Many of them are going to become AI experts, I think, working for companies maybe outside the tech world and in the economy of goods and services, but they're probably have a better chance of kind of sorting out. As you move down the skill levels, people are going to need more assistance in trying to figure out what to do next if their job goes away. And some jobs are going to go away as a result of AI. So how do we develop support programs for those workers? One thing we want to try to avoid is a replay of what we have been experiencing with automation in the manufacturing sector, where we had lots of people lose their jobs, mainly due to automation. There was some trade impact, but it was mainly automation that hurt workers. So how are we going to respond to another wave of automation so that we don't leave individuals, families, and communities feeling like they have been utterly left behind in this wonderful new world that AI is creating? Well, it's not going to be my world, it's your world, and that creates all sorts of cultural and political and social tensions. So I think now's the time to be thinking about that and to be designing policy for the workforce that can respond to individuals as they encounter displacement.
It's not an answer to your policy question at some level. It's a programmatic answer, which eventually speaks to policy and iterates with it. I think what we know now is that there's not a one-size-fits-all answer. And so part of the image of the work that we're doing is to try to enable information, data, in a way that can be yoked closely to a wide range of programmatic and policy efforts that are local, right? So that what we see are experiments that fit a particular place and a particular need and a particular set of value propositions that can then have the connective tissue at the level of standards, but also expertise to aggregate when they work. Right? And so I think much as Brent and others have described the individual stance toward working with AI being one of experimentation and finding out what works, I think we're in a place where, unlike the last manufacturing wave where a few big employers implemented a thing that had an effect on a huge group of individuals, this is going to be bubbling for a while. And we have sets of agencies and employers and organizations around the country that are working really hard to get ahead of what's happening in the context where they can have an impact. If we can let them and empower them and listen to them
and provide them the data that they need
and work with them, we've got a mechanism to learn, right? So rather than saying, yes, the time is right, let's get a regulation in place that fits everything, the answer might be, how do we find the right experiments to learn from and make sure that we have what we need to learn? That means letting our work be driven by the people at the point of impact in a variety of places around the country.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of why I think we feel so strongly about releasing the data that we are, because it's not something that we can do alone.
Right.
We have one perspective, and I think we'd love to see just a broader movement towards transparency across the industry to just really give economists, researchers, social scientists, and really everyone a better picture of what's coming, what we're seeing sort of on that leading edge, so that we have advance notice of what's to come and can sort of all shape it collectively.
Absolutely. It really helps take the conversation away from this abstract thing of what AI is going to do to jobs to, something people can really grasp onto and understand, at least in this little snapshot you're providing. And on that note, I believe it's time for audience questions.
Yes, absolutely. That'd be great. So we have mic runners, and first questions here in the audience. Nobody was expecting questions quite yet. Well, be thinking about a question. I'm just going to go back and answer. Okay, we got a mic right here.
Got a question.
While he's doing that, go ahead. Josh, right here. One thing I would say about regulation is that we always should be looking to regulate for outcome, not input, and the input being the technology. So, thoughts on that. But go ahead, first question over here.
Hi there, thank you so much for your time. I'm Ken Birchfield, a research fellow with the Institute for Family Studies. And one area that I'd love to learn more about is the impact of AI potentially on job satisfaction. I don't remember the exact title right now, but there was an interesting research paper that found that although AI was very helpful in helping researchers develop new materials, it was like a material science discovery situation, they found that it actually had a negative impact on job satisfaction. There was one person interviewed who said, wow, I just feel like my education now is useless. And so when we think about job satisfaction, we know that post-COVID, that's a really important area. First, what findings have you found, if that's been an area that you've looked at as far as how AI influences job satisfaction? And then what are maybe strategies we could have for making sure that as AI percolates into the workforce, it can still be, it won't take away kind of that intrinsic, creative interest that people have when they're using their own knowledge or their own tools to develop things?
So I think it's highly variable across occupations in terms of whether it adds to or subtracts from satisfaction, enthusiasm for work. I also think it really depends on skill level, right? So there are other studies, say with call center workers who start using a chatbot to respond to customers. And it's so helpful to them that their job satisfaction goes way up, along with their productivity and all sorts of other. It's very rare to see this anywhere in literature where you see almost uniformly positive effects, especially for those workers at the bottom. The people who are entry level, lower levels of education and skill, and all of a sudden they've got an entire new vista opens up for them because they've had access to this tool. So it's going to be, I think it's going to be an industry by industry thing, job by job thing, and I think it's it's going to be highly variable. I would say to them, like in the materials development tasks that you were talking about. I mean, the dynamics of that industry have changed so much because of AI in terms of the proliferation of invention, that it would be a very exciting time to be near that industry to see what's going to happen next. But again, it goes back to the agency question. Do you see yourself as a cog in a machine, or do you see yourself as an inventor and somebody who can make contributions by moving up the level of abstraction here to higher levels of creativity? That's really, I think, going to be determinative of whether AI adds to your satisfaction or doesn't. Yeah.
We have a question in the back row.
Hi. Thank you for such an interesting presentation. My name's Julia Lane. I'm with New York University. I work closely with Jason. The question I have is a little bit about the plumbing of what you did, and Jason alluded to this a little bit. And I took a look at what you'd written. I'm a little bit. Here's where I'm confused, right? So I'm an economist / statistician. So your paper starts with looking at conversations, and you've kind of alluded to the selection bias of using Claude to go from conversations. And then you pivot from those conversations, which don't appear to be disambiguated. So you're multiple counting, however many people do multiple questions to Claude. And then you pivot to occupations. And then you pivot somehow from occupations to people. And then you pivot to firms. So I guess in thinking about the plumbing, and before drawing any inferences, I'd like to have a better understanding of how you think you go from conversations to occupations to people to firms. I'd like to get some sense, again in the interest of understanding the plumbing before you get to the sparkly fountain, because this whole conversation has been about the sparkly fountain. What precisely is the underlying construct that you're trying to measure, and how are you getting it validated, right? And then the last piece is, and I still serve on the Secretary of Labor's Workforce Information Advisory Committee. We spent quite a lot of time worrying about ONET because it's largely manually generated and the timeliness is an issue. So a lot of this conversation is about sparkly fountain, so I apologize about pulling you into understanding the plumbing.
No, it's so great. And the plumbing is obviously like what underlies all of the data and the insights. So I'll try, there's a couple components to your question. I'll try to answer as many as I can. So what we do in our paper is we go from individual conversations and we map those onto tasks in ONET. And we also look at accounts too. So in the appendix, we actually see, you mentioned, one person might be doing 100,000 conversations, right? And that might skew the data. So we actually do control for and check that you get the same results if you look on an account level, not just a conversation level. But right, so you go from conversations to tasks in ONET. And then we bubble those tasks up into the occupations those tasks are associated with. So we don't make the claim that every one of those, when we show one of the occupations, say computer programmer, we don't make the claim that everyone who's using the Claude for coding is a programmer, but they are using Claude for tasks associated with programming, which has implications for that occupation. So that's the sort of distinction that we make there. We don't go to the firm level in our paper. We do look at occupational categories like computer and mathematical occupations, which is a sort of the more general category than just software developer. But because we don't have firm level information, we can't make that leap in our paper. And then the last bit was about tasks, jobs. Anyway, I'll leave it there, but I can find you afterwards and chat a bit more if you're curious. Great.
Hi, I'm Drew. I work at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Hi, Julia. I had a question. Nice to see you. Yeah. I had a question around, I think maybe it was Jason, you mentioned or acknowledged kind of the distinction between this data, the Clio data, and kind of like capabilities, benchmarks, or evaluations. And I'm curious whether, I guess this is more a question for Alex, but whether you all have directly compared kind of like task usage data with like Claude's performance on various kind of capability measures. It seems like there'd be some that could tell you something interesting either about limitations, like for example in the medical field, maybe Claude could do some of these tasks, but users are choosing not to, or maybe data limitations in the legal field, like maybe a lot of lawyers are at firms that have kind of enterprise implementations where they don't share data through Clio. I don't know how that works. Or maybe something about the capabilities benchmarks, like seems like it would be good at this, but in practice users are finding it's not. So curious about that.
Yeah, it's absolutely it's a great question, and it really gets to a lot of the underlying philosophy of what we've been really thinking about and why we've been excited. On the one hand, you have these sort of top-down evaluations where I'm going to create a large data set of medical questions and see whether a model can answer those questions well. And when you do, you see really high performance. But there's this big sort of, ecological gap between those like in vitro evaluations and what people are actually doing in vivo, right, with the technology. And it could be that answering medical questions like from a textbook is not actually what makes language models really useful for, say, doctors or medical experts or practitioners. So that's absolutely why we're really excited from the bottom-up perspective, and then really sort of closing that loop and going from the bottom-up perspective to then designing better top-down evaluations, and then sort of repeating that cycle. With respect to concrete results, we actually do find that we have a huge amount of usage in coding, and also from the top-down evaluation side, Claude is the sort of best coding model out there at the moment, and so we do see alignment on that side, certainly. In terms of the other use cases, we do see a large amount of usage for writing, and anecdotally at least. It's harder to get concrete evaluations, but people seem to like Claude's sort of like tone and voice there. But really sort of the economy slide that I showed is sort of like, an eval almost in a way of like how deeply the technology is being diffused throughout the economy. And you can think of that as like, wow, that's a big eval, right? How deep is the model sort of diffusing throughout the economy? And it's one that we can watch and that I expect to be more closely linked to real world impact than some of the top-down ones, although it's a cycle.
Do we have a final question? All right. So Jason, Alex, keep doing all the great work that you're doing. I really appreciate it. Brent, keep highlighting all the work and see what's going on. Ashley, thank you for walking us through this conversation. Obviously, we're going through a lot of changes in this environment, and so stay tuned. And please thank the panel for me.